In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory in 1887, where lawmen's badges meant nothing and survival depended on quick draws and quicker thinking, an unlikely bond would form between two sworn enemies. One was the reckless son of the most feared outlaw gang leader in the Southwest. The other was a captured Apache medicine woman whose people had been hunted like wild animals for decades. When deadly venom coursed through the young bandit's veins, threatening to end his life in agonizing minutes, only ancient wisdom passed down through generations of Apache healers could save him. But would she choose to heal the son of her people's oppressor, or watch justice serve itself as poison claimed another white man's life? This is the extraordinary true story of how hatred gave way to humanity in the unforgiving wilderness, where death rode alongside every sunrise, and mercy was rarer than water in the desert. The sun hung like a merciless eye over the Sonoran Desert, casting shadows that offered no relief from the blistering heat. Tommy Blackwood wiped sweat from his forehead as he guided his horse through the rocky terrain, the leather reins slick in his calloused hands. At 23, Tommy carried himself with the swagger of a man who had never known defeat, his father's reputation as the leader of the notorious Blackwood gang, serving as both shield and sword in the lawless territories of Arizona and New Mexico. The year 1887 had been profitable for the Blackwood gang. Train robberies, bank heists, and cattle rustling had filled their coffers, while territorial marshals seemed always one step behind their dust trails. Tommy had grown up believing the world owed him whatever he could take, and he had taken plenty. His father, Iron Jack Blackwood, had built an empire of fear and violence that stretched across 3 territories, with hideouts scattered like deadly seeds throughout the desert mountains. On this particular morning, Tommy rode alone toward the abandoned mining camp of Copper Creek, where he was supposed to meet 2 other gang members to plan their next robbery. The Southern Pacific Railroad had increased security on their trains, but Iron Jack had received word of a payroll shipment that would be too tempting to ignore. Tommy's job was to scout the route and identify the best location for an ambush. The mining camp had been deserted for over a year, its inhabitants driven away by a combination of played-out veins and increasing Apache raids. The skeletal remains of wooden buildings stood like tombstones against the azure sky, their weathered boards bleached white by the relentless sun. Tommy had visited the camp twice before, always finding it empty except for the occasional rattlesnake or desert rat. As he approached the largest building, what had once been the mining company's headquarters, Tommy noticed something different. Fresh horse tracks circled the structure, and wisps of smoke drifted from what remained of the chimney. Someone had been here recently, perhaps was still here. Tommy's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, a weapon that had served him well in numerous gunfights. He dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a rotting fence post before drawing his pistol. The smart thing would be to ride away and return another day, but Tommy Blackwood had never been accused of being smart. Recklessness was a family trait, one that had served the Blackwoods well in their criminal endeavors, but had also cost them several members over the years. The front door of the building hung askew on broken hinges, creaking softly in the desert breeze. Tommy pushed it open with his boot, stepping into the relative coolness of the interior. Shafts of sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. The acrid smell of cold ashes mixed with something else, something organic and unfamiliar. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden by shadows, Tommy spotted movement. His finger tightened on the trigger as he raised his weapon, calling out in a voice that echoed off the bare walls. "Come out where I can see you. Nice and slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." A figure emerged from the shadows, and Tommy's breath caught in his throat. It was an Apache woman, probably in her 40s, wearing traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. Her long black hair was streaked with premature gray, and Her dark eyes held a mixture of defiance and resignation. Most striking were the rope burns around her wrists, evidence of recent captivity. "Well," Tommy said, keeping his gun trained on her, "looks like I found myself a runaway squaw. I bet there's a nice reward for bringing you back to whatever reservation you escaped from." The woman said nothing, but her eyes never left his face. There was something unsettling about her gaze, as if she could see straight through to his soul. Tommy had faced down armed men without flinching, but this silent Apache woman made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't understand. "What's the matter? Cut out your tongue." Tommy stepped closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Or maybe you don't speak English. All you people look the same to me anyway." Still the woman remained silent, her expression unchanged. Tommy was beginning to feel foolish, standing there with his gun drawn on an obviously unarmed captive. But something about her stillness, her complete lack of fear, kept him on edge. "Tell you what," he said, holstering his weapon, but keeping his hand near the grip. "You stay right there while I look around. Maybe whoever was keeping you prisoner left something valuable behind." Tommy began searching the room, kicking aside debris and examining the few remaining pieces of furniture. The Apache woman watched his every move, but made no attempt to flee or hide. It was as if she was waiting for something, though Tommy couldn't imagine what. Behind what had once been the assayer's desk, Tommy discovered a leather saddlebag that someone had obviously abandoned in haste. Inside, he found a small pouch of gold dust, some dried beef jerky, and a bottle of whiskey. Not a fortune, but better than nothing. As he straightened up, admiring his find, he heard a soft sound from behind him. The Apache woman had moved closer, so silently that he hadn't detected her approach. In her hand, she held what appeared to be a small bundle of dried plants and herbs. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were whispering something in her native language. "What do you think you're doing?" Tommy demanded, spinning around to face her. "I told you to stay put." For the first time, the woman spoke, her English accented but clear. "You are in great danger, young man. The spirits have shown me your death approaching like a shadow across the desert." Tommy laughed, a harsh sound in the empty building. "Lady, the only danger here is you running your mouth when you should be keeping quiet. I've got more important things to worry about than your Indian mumbo-jumbo. The copper-colored death will find you before the sun reaches its highest point," she continued, ignoring his mockery. "Unless you heed the warning and change your path." "Copper-colored death?" Tommy shook his head in disgust. "You people and your crazy superstitions. The only copper around here is what's left in these played-out mines." The woman's expression grew more serious, if that were possible. "Not the metal, young warrior. The serpent with scales like burnished copper, whose bite brings swift death to those who do not respect the desert." A chill ran down Tommy's spine despite the heat. Copperhead snakes were indeed common in this area, and their bites were often fatal without proper treatment. But he pushed the feeling aside, refusing to be intimidated by what he saw as primitive superstition. "Thanks for the warning, but I can take care of myself," he said, turning back to examine his loot. "Now quit your fortune-telling and sit down before I decide you're more trouble than you're worth." The Apache woman retreated to her corner, but her eyes never left him. Tommy could feel her gaze like a physical weight as he continued searching the room. He found a few more items of minor value. A silver pocket watch that had stopped working, some ammunition for a rifle he didn't have, and a small leather journal filled with notes about mining operations. As he bent down to examine a promising-looking wooden crate, Tommy heard the sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. It was a dry, rattling noise like pebbles being shaken in a tin can. But he recognized it immediately as the warning call of a venomous snake. The copperhead was coiled less than 3 feet from his right hand, its thick body beautifully marked with the copper-colored bands that gave the species its name. The snake's triangular head was raised, and its vertical pupils were fixed on Tommy with predatory intensity. The creature was clearly agitated, probably disturbed from its hiding place beneath the crate when Tommy had moved it. Time seemed to slow as Tommy stared into the snake's cold eyes. He had encountered rattlesnakes before and knew enough to freeze completely, but copperheads were different. They were more aggressive, more likely to strike without provocation, and they were remarkably fast when they decided to attack. Tommy's mind raced through his options. He could try to back away slowly, but any sudden movement might trigger a strike. He could draw his gun and try to shoot the snake, but the motion required a draw and would certainly provoke an attack. The Apache woman's warning echoed in his mind. The copper-colored death will find you before the sun reaches its highest point. The snake's rattle grew more insistent, and its head began to sway slightly from side to side. Tommy knew these were signs of imminent attack. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to decide what to do. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to do something, anything, but his rational mind understood that movement meant death. "Do not move," came the Apache woman's voice, soft but urgent. The Copper Brother is frightened and confused. He seeks only to return to his home beneath the stones. "Easy for you to say," Tommy whispered through gritted teeth. "You're not the one about to get bit. Trust in the wisdom of those who have walked this desert for countless generations," she replied. "The Copper Brother will not strike unless you force his hand." But even as she spoke, the snake's behavior changed. Its rattle became a continuous blur of sound, and its head drew back into the classic S-curve that preceded a strike. Tommy realized with growing horror that the creature was beyond reasoning or patience. It was going to attack regardless of what he did or didn't do. The strike came with lightning speed. One moment the snake was coiled and ready. The next its fangs were buried deep in the flesh of Tommy's right forearm. The pain was immediate and intense, like being stabbed with two red-hot needles. Tommy cried out and instinctively jerked his arm back, which only drove the fangs deeper. The copperhead held on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, pumping its venom into Tommy's bloodstream before finally releasing its grip and slithering away to hide beneath the debris. Tommy staggered backward, clutching his wounded arm as two perfect puncture wounds began to seep blood. "No, no, no," he muttered, staring at the bite marks in disbelief. He had seen men die from copperhead bites before, and it was not a pleasant way to go. The venom would spread through his system, causing excruciating pain, paralysis, and eventually death if left untreated. The Apache woman approached slowly, her herb bundle still in her hand. "The Copper Brother has marked you, as the spirits foretold. But death is not yet certain. There are ways to fight the poison, if you are willing to trust in ancient knowledge." Tommy looked at her with new eyes, his earlier arrogance evaporating in the face of mortal danger. "You know how to treat snakebite. My grandmother was a medicine woman, as was her grandmother before her. The knowledge of healing has been passed down through many generations of my people. But the question remains, will you accept help from one you have shown nothing but contempt?" Tommy felt the first waves of nausea beginning to wash over him as the venom started its deadly work. His arm was already beginning to swell, and a burning sensation was spreading up toward his shoulder. He had perhaps an hour, maybe two at most, before the poison would overcome his system entirely. Pride warred with desperation in his mind. Everything he had been taught about Apache people told him they were savages, enemies to be conquered or eliminated. But his father's teachings seemed less important now than the growing certainty that he was going to die without help. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice already becoming slightly slurred as the venom affected his nervous system. "I want nothing from you," she replied. "But the spirits demand balance in all things. You have taken much from this world, young warrior. Perhaps it is time you learned to give something back." Tommy sank to his knees as weakness began to overcome him. The bite wound was swelling rapidly, turning an ugly purple color that spoke of serious tissue damage. He could feel his heart racing as it tried to pump the poisoned blood through his system, and his vision was beginning to blur around the edges. "Please," he whispered, the word foreign on his tongue. Thomas Blackwood had never begged for anything in his life, but facing death stripped away all pretense and pride. "I don't want to die like this." The Apache woman knelt beside him, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle as she examined the bite wound. "Death comes for all men, but perhaps this is not your day to meet it. The Copper Brothers' venom is strong, but the medicine of my people is stronger still." She began to unpack her herb bundle, revealing various plants and roots that Tommy didn't recognize. Some were fresh, still showing traces of morning dew, while others were dried and carefully preserved. Her movements were precise and confident, speaking of years of experience and training in the healing arts. "What is your name?" she asked as she worked, crushing some of the herbs between her fingers to release their aromatic oils. "Tommy," he gasped, finding it increasingly difficult to speak. "Tommy Blackwood." Her hand stilled for a moment at the mention of his surname. "Blackwood, you are the son of the one they call Iron Jack." It wasn't a question, and Tommy nodded weakly. He waited for her reaction, for the hatred and disgust he was sure would follow. His father's gang had been responsible for numerous attacks on Apache settlements, and the Blackwood name was synonymous with violence and death throughout the territory. But instead of anger, he saw something like sadness cross her features. "Then you're the son of the man who killed my husband and son in the raid on our winter camp 3 years ago." Tommy's blood, already poisoned, seemed to turn to ice in his veins. He had been present at that raid, had watched as his father's men destroyed the Apache settlement and killed dozens of men, women, and children. It had been presented to him as a necessary action, a way to send a message that the Blackwood gang would not tolerate interference with their operations. Now, faced with the widow of one of his victims, Tommy began to understand the true cost of his family's violence. This woman had every reason to let him die, to watch as the Copperhead's venom claimed another Blackwood. Justice would be served without her having to lift a finger. "I remember you," she said quietly, still preparing her medicines. "You were there that day, watching from horseback as your father's men burned our homes. You said nothing to stop the killing." "I'm sorry," Tommy whispered, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. "I'm so sorry for what we did to your people." She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of sincerity. "Sorrow is easy when death approaches, but the spirits will judge the truth of your words." The Apache woman, whose name Tommy still didn't know, continued her preparations. She mixed various herbs with water from a small skin bag, creating a paste that gave off a pungent medicinal smell. Other plants were bundled together and set aside, apparently for use in a different stage of the treatment. "This will hurt," she warned, applying the herbal paste directly to the bite wounds. "The medicine must draw out the poison, and that process brings its own pain." Tommy gritted his teeth as fire seemed to spread from the bite's site. The paste felt like it was burning through his flesh, but he forced himself to remain still. If this Apache healer could save his life, he would endure whatever suffering was necessary. As she worked, the woman began to chant in her native language, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of Tommy's poison heart. He couldn't understand the words, but there was something hypnotic about the sound, something that helped to focus his mind away from the pain. The chanting continued as she tied bundles of herbs around his arm, securing them with strips of leather cut from her own clothing. The sun had moved higher in the sky, and Tommy realized that the Apache woman's prediction was coming true. The copper-colored death had indeed found him before the sun reached its highest point. But she was fighting to save him, this woman whose family he had helped destroy. Tommy couldn't understand why she would show such mercy to an enemy, but he was profoundly grateful. As the herbal treatment began to take effect and the pain in his arm started to diminish slightly, he made a silent promise to himself. If he survived this, if the Apache medicine could overcome the Copperhead's venom, he would find a way to make amends for the violence he had participated in. The world of easy answers and simple hatreds that his father had created was crumbling around him, replaced by a more complex understanding of justice and mercy. The woman sat back on her heels, surveying her work with the critical eye of an experienced healer. "The first treatment is complete," she said. "Now we must wait and see if the spirits favor your recovery." "Will I live?" Tommy asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "That depends on many things," she replied. "The strength of the venom, the power of the medicine, and the will of the one who was bitten. But most importantly, it depends on whether you have learned something from this experience." Tommy looked at this remarkable woman who was trying to save the life of her enemy's son, and he began to understand that his education was just beginning. The desert had taught him a harsh lesson about the consequences of his actions, and the Apache healer was offering him a chance at redemption he didn't deserve. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, and the herbal medicines worked their ancient magic, Tommy Blackwood prepared to face the most important choice of his young life. He could return to his father's world of violence and hatred, where he could find a new path forward, one that honored the mercy he had been shown. The copper-colored death still flowed through his veins, but for the first time in his life, Tommy felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the abandoned mining camp as Tommy Blackwood drifted in and out of consciousness. The Apache woman, who had finally told him her name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, sat nearby, monitoring his condition with the practiced eye of someone who had fought death many times before. The herbal paste on his arm had hardened into a protective crust, and the swelling had begun to subside, but the real battle was taking place inside his body as ancient medicine warred against deadly venom. During his lucid moments, Tommy found himself studying this remarkable woman who held his life in her weathered hands. Ayana appeared to be somewhere in her 40s, but the hardships of reservation life and the loss of her family had aged her beyond her years. Her face was a map of sorrow and wisdom, with deep lines around her eyes that spoke of countless tears shed in private moments. Yet there was also a strength in her bearing, a quiet dignity that no amount of suffering could diminish. "Why?" Tommy asked during one of his clearer periods, his voice hoarse from the battle raging within his system. "Why are you helping me when I've done nothing but bring pain to your people?" Ayana looked up from the small fire she had built to prepare additional medicines. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, a thin gray line against the brilliant blue sky. "My grandmother used to tell me that hatred is like swallowing poison and expecting your enemy to die. I have carried enough poison in my heart for 3 winters. I will not carry more. But your husband, your son..." Tommy struggled to find the right words. "I was there. I could have tried to stop it, but I didn't. I just watched." "Yes," she said simply. "You watched. But you were barely more than a boy then, raised in violence, knowing nothing else. The man who lies dying before me is not the same person who sat on that horse 3 years ago." Tommy wanted to argue, to tell her that he was exactly the same person, that nothing fundamental had changed about him. But as the words formed in his mind, he realized they weren't true. Something had shifted when the Copperhead's fangs had pierced his flesh, something deeper than just the physical effects of the venom. For the first time in his life, he had come face to face with his own mortality, and the experience was changing him in ways he didn't fully understand. As the hours passed, Ayana continued her treatments. She prepared teas from various roots and herbs, encouraging Tommy to drink even when the taste made him gag. She changed the poultices on his arm regularly, each new mixture drawing more of the poison from his system. Most importantly, She never left his side, maintaining a constant vigil that spoke of deep commitment to her healing calling. "Tell me about your family," Tommy said during one of the quieter moments, when the pain had receded enough to allow for conversation. "Your husband and son." Ayanna was quiet for so long that Tommy thought she hadn't heard him or was choosing not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Nailnish was a good man, a skilled hunter who could track a deer through stone country and provide for our family even in the hardest times. He made me laugh with his stories and taught our son Bidzil the old ways of our people." Bidzil was 12 summers old, just beginning to learn the responsibilities of manhood. He had his father's kind heart and his grandmother's quick mind. She paused, staring into the fire as if she could see the faces of her lost loved ones in the dancing flames. "They died defending our camp, trying to buy time for the women and children to escape into the mountains. Your father's men showed no mercy, even to those who could not fight back." Tommy felt a fresh wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the snake venom. He had heard his father and the other gang members joke about that raid, laughing about how easy it had been to overrun the Apache settlement. They had talked about the Indians as if they were wild animals rather than human beings with families and hopes and dreams. "I don't remember much about my own mother," Tommy found himself saying. "She died when I was 6 during a cholera outbreak in Tucson. My father never talked about her much after that, just got harder and meaner with every passing year. I think her death broke something inside him that never healed." "Grief can poison a man's soul if he lets it," Ayanna observed. "Your father chose to spread his pain to others rather than heal from it. That is why he became the man he is today." "And what about you?" Tommy asked. "How did you avoid letting grief turn you into something ugly?" Ayanna smiled for the first time since he had met her, a brief but genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Who says I avoided it? For 2 years after the raid, I carried such hatred in my heart that it nearly consumed me. I dreamed of revenge, of finding ways to hurt those who had hurt me. It was only when I realized that my hatred was killing me more surely than any bullet that I began to look for another path." "What changed?" "I met an old medicine man named Hasty and a member of the Navajo tribe who had also lost family to white violence. He told me that the greatest victory over our enemies was not to kill them, but to remain human despite what they had done to us. He taught me that healing others was a way of healing myself, that every life I saved helped to balance the scales of justice in some small way." Tommy pondered this as another wave of pain washed over him. The venom was still working its way through his system, but he could feel that the crisis was passing. His heart rate had stabilized, and the burning sensation in his arm was gradually being replaced by a deep, throbbing ache that spoke of healing rather than deterioration. As evening approached and the desert began to cool, Ayanna prepared what she called the final treatment. This involved a complex ritual that combined herbal medicines with ceremonial elements that were foreign to Tommy's experience. She painted symbols on his forehead with a mixture of clay and plant extracts, chanting in her native language while moving around him in a precise pattern. "What does all this mean?" Tommy asked, genuinely curious rather than mocking. "I am asking the spirits to complete the healing that began with the medicines," she explained. "The body and the soul are connected, and both must be treated if the cure is to be complete. The symbols represent balance, the restoration of harmony between opposing forces." Tommy had been raised in a world where such beliefs were dismissed as primitive superstition, but he found himself moved by the sincerity and dignity of Ayanna's ritual. Whether or not he believed in the spiritual aspects of her healing, he couldn't deny that her treatments were working. The Copperhead's venom, which should have killed him hours ago, was gradually being neutralized by medicines that had been perfected over countless generations. As night fell over the desert, Ayanna finally allowed herself to rest, settling down beside the fire with her back against a wooden crate. Tommy, though still weak, was clearly out of immediate danger. His color had returned to normal, and the swelling in his arm had reduced significantly. Most importantly, the symptoms of systemic poisoning had largely disappeared. "You saved my life," Tommy said, his voice filled with wonder at the simple fact of his continued existence. "I should be dead right now, but somehow you pulled me back from the edge." "The medicines saved your life," Ayanna corrected. "I was merely the vessel through which ancient knowledge flowed. My grandmother and her grandmother before her, all the way back to the first medicine women of our people, they're the ones who deserve credit for your healing." "Still," Tommy insisted, "you chose to use that knowledge to help me instead of watching me die. After everything my family has done to yours, that must have been a difficult choice." Ayanna stared into the fire for a long moment before responding. "Do you know what Hastian told me when I asked him how I could forgive those who had murdered my family? He said that forgiveness was not about them. It was about me. He said that carrying hatred was like grasping a burning coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else, but you are the one who gets burned." Tommy absorbed this wisdom, turning it over in his mind like a man examining a precious stone. He had spent his entire life in a world where strength was measured by one's ability to inflict pain on others, where mercy was seen as weakness and forgiveness as surrender. But lying there in the desert, his life saved by the very person he should have considered his enemy, he began to question everything he had been taught. "What happens now?" he asked. "When the sun comes up tomorrow, what do we do?" "That depends on what you have learned from this experience," Ayanna replied. "You can return to your father's camp and continue living the life you have always known, pretending that none of this ever happened. Or you can choose a different path, one that honors the second chance you have been given." "What kind of different path?" "That is for you to decide. But I will tell you this. The spirits do not save a man's life without purpose. You have been given an opportunity that few receive, the chance to become something better than what you were. The question is whether you will have the courage to take it." Tommy spent much of the night staring up at the vast canopy of stars that spread across the desert sky, thinking about the choice that lay before him. He could hear Ayanna's steady breathing as she slept nearby, this remarkable woman who had shown him a mercy he didn't deserve. Her presence was both comforting and challenging, a living reminder of the path not taken. As dawn approached, Tommy made his decision. When Ayanna woke, she found him sitting by the rekindled fire, fully alert and apparently recovered from his ordeal. The bite marks on his arm were healing cleanly, and the last traces of venom had been purged from his system. "I want to help you," he said without preamble. "I know I can never undo the harm my family has caused, but maybe I can do something to balance the scales, as you put it." Ayanna studied his face carefully, looking for signs of insincerity or self-deception. "This is not a decision to be made lightly, Tommy Blackwood. If you turn against your father's gang, you will become a hunted man. They will see you as a traitor, and there will be nowhere in the territory where you can feel safe." "I understand that," Tommy replied. "But I also understand that I can't go back to being the person I was yesterday. That man was already dead when the snake bit me. You've given me a new life, and I want to use it for something worthwhile. And what exactly do you propose to do?" Tommy had thought about this question through the long hours of the night, and he believed he had found an answer. "My father is planning a train robbery next week. A big one, targeting a payroll shipment for the copper mines near Bisbee. If I could get word to the territorial marshal, maybe they could set up an ambush and finally put an end to the Blackwood gang." Ayanna was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of what Tommy was suggesting. It was an incredibly dangerous plan, one that would almost certainly result in his being disowned by his family and marked for death by his former associates. But it would also potentially save innocent lives and bring justice for the many crimes committed by the gang over the years. "There's a trading post about 15 miles south of here," she finally said. "The owner, a man named Sam McBride, sometimes carries messages for the territorial authorities. If you're serious about this course of action, he might be willing to help. You know this man? He was a friend to my husband's family, one of the few white men in the territory who treated Apache people with respect. When I escaped from the reservation 3 days ago, he gave me food and supplies for my journey. Tommy was surprised to learn that Ayanna had been a recent escapee from the reservation system. He had assumed she had been living in the desert for much longer, perhaps as part of one of the small bands that still resisted government control. "Why did you leave the reservation?" he asked. "Because it is a place of slow death for my people," she replied bitterly. "The government agents treat us like animals, giving us spoiled food and diseased blankets while they steal the supplies that are supposed to keep us alive. I watched too many of our elders die from sickness and despair. I cannot stay there any longer. Where will you go now?" "There are still some of my people living free in the mountains of Mexico, hiding in places the American and Mexican armies cannot reach. I hope to find them and spend my remaining years among those who remember the old ways." Tommy felt a pang of loss at the thought of Ayanna leaving. In the space of one day and night, this remarkable woman had become more important to him than anyone he had ever known. She had not only saved his life, but had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined. "Come with me to the trading post," he said impulsively. "Help me set up this meeting with the marshal. After what you've done for me, the least I can do is make sure you reach Mexico safely." Ayanna shook her head. "That is not my path, Tommy Blackwood. You must walk this new road alone, as I must walk mine. But know that wherever you go, whatever choices you make, you carry with you the blessings of my ancestors and the hope that you will use your second chance wisely." They spent the morning preparing for their separate journeys. Ayanna gathered her few possessions and prepared additional medicines for Tommy to carry, herbs that would help his arm finish healing, and powders that could be used to treat other injuries or illnesses. Tommy checked his weapons and saddled his horse, mentally preparing himself for what would likely be the most dangerous undertaking of his life. Before they parted ways, Ayanna performed one final ceremony, painting new symbols on Tommy's forehead with red clay mixed with sacred plants. "These will protect you on your journey," she explained, "and remind you of the promises you have made." As they stood facing each other in the harsh light of the desert sun, both knew they would probably never meet again. Ayanna had her own dangerous journey ahead of her, traveling hundreds of miles through territory patrolled by soldiers who shot Apache on sight. Tommy was about to betray everything he had ever known, risking not just his own life, but his very identity. "Thank you," Tommy said, the words seeming inadequate for what he felt. "For everything. Use your life well, Tommy Blackwood," Ayanna replied. "Make it count for something more than violence and pain. That is all the thanks I need." With that, she turned and walked away into the desert, disappearing among the rocks and scrub brush like a spirit returning to the wilderness. Tommy watched until she was completely out of sight, then mounted his horse and rode south toward the trading post and whatever fate awaited him there. The sun was approaching its zenith once again, but this time Tommy faced it without fear. The copper-colored death had found him and been defeated, thanks to the courage and compassion of an Apache medicine woman who had chosen mercy over vengeance. Now it was his turn to choose, to decide what kind of man he would become in the life he had been given back. As his horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the desert floor, Tommy Blackwood began the long journey from outlaw to something he had never imagined he could be, a man of honor. The trading post owned by Sam McBride sat like a weathered island in a vast ocean of desert, its adobe walls baked golden by decades of southwestern sun. Tommy Blackwood approached it with the caution of a man who understood he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. His arms still ached from the copperhead bite, but the healing was progressing well under Ayanna's herbal treatments. More importantly, the spiritual wound that had been opened by his encounter with the Apache medicine woman was beginning to mend in ways he was only starting to understand. McBride's establishment was more than just a trading post. It served as an unofficial meeting ground for the various peoples who called the territory home. Mexican vaqueros rubbed shoulders with American miners, while Apache and Navajo traders conducted business alongside frontier merchants and territorial officials. It was neutral ground, a place where violence was forbidden and information flowed as freely as the whiskey that McBride served to his customers. The proprietor himself was a study in contradictions. Sam McBride stood well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who had spent decades doing hard physical labor. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his blue eyes held an intelligence that suggested he was far more educated than his rough appearance might indicate. Most remarkably, for a white man operating in Apache territory, he was universally trusted by the various Native American tribes in the region. When Tommy dismounted in front of the trading post, McBride emerged from the building with the measured pace of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. His eyes took in Tommy's expensive horse and fine clothing, the quality of his weapons, and the way he carried himself with the unconscious arrogance of someone accustomed to being feared. "You be one of the Blackwood boys," McBride said without preamble, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent that spoke of origins far from the American Southwest. "Heard tell your daddy's been expanding his operations lately. Running out of banks to rob in your usual territory?" Tommy was taken aback by the man's directness. In his experience, most people either cowered before the Blackwood name or challenged it with bluster and bravado. McBride seemed to treat it as simply another fact about the weather, interesting but not particularly threatening. "I'm not here on my father's business," Tommy said carefully. "I need to get a message to the territorial marshal, and I heard you might be able to help with that." McBride's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise he had shown. "Now, that's interesting. Tommy Blackwood wanted to contact the law. Mind if I ask what this is about?" Tommy glanced around, noting the other customers within earshot. A Mexican trader was examining a selection of knives, while his wife looked at bolts of cloth. 2 miners sat at a rough wooden table, drinking beer and playing cards. None of them appeared to be paying attention to the conversation, but Tommy had learned caution in a hard school. "Could we talk privately?" he asked. McBride studied him for a moment longer, then nodded toward the back of the building. "My office is through there. But I should warn you, young Blackwood, that if you're planning some kind of trick or trap, you've picked the wrong man to try it on." They made their way through the cluttered interior of the trading post, past shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to mining equipment to Indian pottery. McBride's office was a small, neat room dominated by a massive oak desk that looked like it had been transported from some eastern city at considerable expense. The walls were lined with maps of the territory, marked with various routes and locations in different colored inks. "Have a seat," McBride said, settling into the chair behind his desk. "Now, what's this all about?" Tommy took a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke the words aloud, there would be no taking them back. "My father is planning a train robbery. A big one. I want to stop it." If McBride was surprised by this revelation, he didn't show it. He leaned back in his chair and studied Tommy with the intensity of a man trying to read a difficult book. "That's quite a change of heart. Mind telling me what brought it on?" For the next hour, Tommy told McBride everything. He described his encounter with Iona, the copperhead bite that should have killed him, and the way the Apache medicine woman had saved his life despite having every reason to let him die. He talked about watching his father's men destroy the Apache camp 3 years earlier, and how that memory had taken on new meaning in light of his recent experiences. McBride listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper, but never breaking eye contact with Tommy. When the story was finished, he was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing what he had heard against his own knowledge and experience. "Iona," he said finally, small woman, maybe 40 years old, with gray streaks in her hair and rope burns on her wrists. "You know her. She passed through here 3 days ago, heading south toward the border. Didn't give me her real name, but I recognized her from the reservation. She was married to a man named Nailnish, had a son called Bidzil. Lost them both in a raid about 3 years back. McBride's expression had grown hard. Your father's raid, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Tommy said simply. She told me about them, and she still saved your life. McBride shook his head in amazement. That woman has more strength and character than most people I've known, Indian or white. Will you help me get word to the marshal? Tommy asked. McBride was quiet for another long moment, then opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a sheet of official-looking stationery. Marshal Henderson is due to pass through here in 2 days, on his way back from investigating some trouble down near the border. I can arrange for you to meet with him then, if you're sure this is what you want to do. I'm sure. You understand what you're risking here, don't you? Your father won't just disown you for this. He'll put a price on your head that every gunfighter and bounty hunter in the territory will be eager to collect. Tommy nodded grimly. I know, but I can't go back to being the person I was. Too much has changed. Fair enough. McBride began writing on the stationery, his pen scratching steadily across the paper. I'll send word to Henderson tonight. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here. I've got a room upstairs that you can use, and my cook makes the best beef stew this side of San Antonio. I appreciate that, but I should warn you that associating with me could be dangerous. If word gets out that I'm here, my father might decide you're an enemy. McBride laughed, a rich sound that filled the small office. Son, I've been running this place for 15 years, and in that time I've managed to stay on speaking terms with Apache war chiefs, Mexican bandits, territorial marshals, and everyone in between. I think I can handle one outlaw gang, even if it is led by Iron Jack Blackwood. Over the next 2 days, Tommy found himself experiencing a different side of frontier life than he had ever known. McBride's trading post was a crossroads where people from all walks of life came together, and Tommy was fascinated by the stories he heard and the relationships he observed. There was Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican woman who had lost her husband to Comanche raiders, but had managed to build a successful freight business hauling supplies between the mining camps. She treated everyone with the same courtesy, whether they were wealthy mine owners or dirt-poor prospectors just starting out. Old Pete Carlson was a former cavalry sergeant who had served in the Indian Wars, but had come to respect his former enemies after years of fighting them. He spoke fluent Apache and often served as an unofficial translator when tribal members came to trade. Most impressive of all was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female physicians in the territory who traveled from settlement to settlement providing medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay or their racial background. She had treated Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers with equal skill, earning respect from both sides of the conflict. These people represented a different way of living in the harsh landscape of the American Southwest, one based on mutual respect and cooperation rather than domination and violence. Tommy began to understand that there were alternatives to the world his father had created, communities where people could work together despite their differences. On the morning of the second day, Marshal Henderson arrived with a small escort of territorial rangers. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence. His reputation for fairness and integrity was legendary throughout the territory, but so was his determination to bring outlaws to justice. "So you're Iron Jack's boy," Henderson said when McBride introduced them. "Have to say, this is the last thing I expected when Sam sent word he had information about your father's activities." "I imagine it is," Tommy replied, "but I'm hoping you'll hear me out." They met in McBride's office, with the trading post owner serving as an unofficial mediator. Tommy once again told his story, focusing this time on the specific details of the planned train robbery. He provided information about the time and location of the attack, the number of men involved, and the escape routes his father intended to use. Henderson listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify details or test Tommy's knowledge. It became clear that the marshal was taking the information seriously, but he was also deeply skeptical of Tommy's motives. "This could all be an elaborate trap," Henderson said when Tommy had finished. "A way to lure me and my men into an ambush. Your father's tried that kind of thing before." "I know how it looks," Tommy acknowledged. "But I'm willing to prove my sincerity." Ow! Tommy had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time thinking about his answer. "Let me ride with you when you set up the ambush. If this is a trap, I'll be right there in the middle of it when the shooting starts." Henderson exchanged glances with McBride, who nodded slightly. "That's not a bad offer," the marshal admitted. "But it still doesn't explain why you're willing to betray your own family." Once again, Tommy found himself telling the story of his encounter with Ayanna, but this time he focused on the larger lessons he had learned about justice and mercy. He spoke about the Apache woman's choice to heal rather than hate, and how that choice had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered. "She saved my life when she could have let me die," Tommy concluded. "Not because I deserved it, but because she chose to be better than the situation demanded. I want to make that choice too." Henderson was quiet for a long time, studying Tommy with the intensity of a man trying to peer into another soul. Finally, he spoke. "Assuming I believe you, and I'm not saying I do yet, what happens after we stop this train robbery? You can't go back to your father's gang, and you can't stay in the territory. Every outlaw between here and California will be gunning for you." "I've thought about that," Tommy said. "There's a town in Oregon Territory where my mother's sister lives. I could start over there, maybe use the education my father paid for to become something other than a criminal. And you think it'll be that easy? Just walk away from 23 years of being Iron Jack Blackwood's son?" Tommy touched the healing bite mark on his arm, remembering Ayanna's teachings about the balance between opposing forces. "No, I don't think it'll be easy, but I think it'll be worth it." Henderson made his decision. "All right, Blackwood, I'll take your information and set up an operation based on it. But if this turns out to be a trap, if even one of my men gets hurt because of false intelligence, I'll make sure you hang right alongside your father." "Understood." The next few days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Henderson sent word to the railroad, warning them of the planned attack and coordinating with their security forces. He assembled a team of his best rangers and began positioning them along the route where the robbery was supposed to take place. Tommy provided detailed information about his father's methods and tactics, helping Henderson understand how the Blackwood gang typically operated. It was strange, using his insider knowledge to plan the destruction of his own family's criminal enterprise, but Tommy felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. 3 days before the scheduled robbery, Tommy received an unexpected visitor. His younger brother Jake, barely 18 years old, arrived at the trading post looking for him. Jake had always been Tommy's closest confidant within the family, the one person who might understand his decision. "Pa's been looking for you," Jake said without preamble. "He's mad as hell that you missed the planning meeting." "What are you doing here, Tommy?" Tommy looked at his brother, seeing himself as he might have been just a week earlier. Jake had their father's cold eyes and quick temper, but he hadn't yet committed the kinds of crimes that would mark him as irredeemably lost. Maybe there was still hope for him. "I'm trying to become a better man," Tommy said simply. "And I'm hoping you might want to do the same." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Tommy told Jake everything, just as he had told McBride and Henderson. He watched his brother's expression change from confusion to anger to something that might have been understanding. When he finished, Jake was quiet for several minutes. "You're really going to do it?" Jake said finally. "You're really going to betray your own family?" "I'm trying to save what's left of my family," Tommy corrected. "Pa's path leads nowhere but death or prison. You don't have to follow him down that road. And what become a farmer in Oregon? Live some boring, respectable life where nobody knows who we really are." "Yes," Tommy said without hesitation. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." Jake shook his head in disgust. You've gone soft, brother. That Apache which cast some kind of spell on you made you forget what you are." "She didn't cast a spell," Tommy replied. "She just showed me that there was another way to live, another way to be strong." The brothers talked through the night, with Tommy trying desperately to convince Jake to abandon their father's criminal plans, and Jake arguing that loyalty to family was more important than abstract moral principles. As dawn approached, it became clear that Jake had made his choice. "I can't abandon Pa," Jake said as he prepared to leave. "He's family, and family sticks together no matter what, even when family is wrong." Especially then, Jake mounted his horse and looked down at Tommy with something like pity in his eyes. "I won't tell him where you are, Tommy. That much I'll do for you. But after this, we're strangers. You understand that, don't you?" Tommy nodded, feeling a pain in his chest that was worse than anything the Copperhead's venom had caused. "I understand. Goodbye, brother." "Goodbye, Jake." Tommy watched his younger brother ride away, knowing he might never see him again. The price of his new life was becoming clear. He would lose everything and everyone he had ever known. But as he thought about Ayanna and the choice she had made to heal rather than hate, he knew he was on the right path. The day of the train robbery dawned clear and hot. Tommy rode out with Marshal Henderson and his rangers, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was about to happen. They positioned themselves along the railway line where the Blackwood gang was expected to strike, hidden among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the desert landscape. At precisely noon, the train came into view, smoke billowing from its stack as it chugged along the steel rails that connected the mining camps to the outside world. Tommy could see his father and the other gang members moving into position, just as he had helped them plan so many times before. What happened next was swift and decisive. The Blackwood gang rode out of their concealment, expecting to face only a few railroad guards. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by 20 heavily armed rangers who had been waiting for them. The battle was over almost before it began. Iron Jack Blackwood, the man who had terrorized the territory for over a decade, surrendered when he realized the futility of resistance. Most of his men did the same, though 2 tried to fight their way out and were killed in the attempt. Jake, thankfully, was not among them. Tommy's younger brother had been wounded in the leg, but was very much alive. As the dust settled and the prisoners were secured, Iron Jack's eyes found his oldest son among the rangers. The look that passed between them was one of pure hatred, mixed with disappointment and betrayal that cut Tommy deeper than any physical wound. "You did this," Iron Jack said, his voice filled with venom that matched anything the Copperhead had possessed. "My own son turned Judas." Tommy met his father's gaze without flinching. "I did what I had to do to stop the killing. You're no son of mine. Maybe that's for the best." Marshal Henderson approached as the prisoners were being loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial prison. "You did the right thing, Blackwood," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you saved a lot of innocent lives today." Tommy nodded, but felt no satisfaction in what had been accomplished. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As he watched his father and brother being taken away in chains, he wondered if Ayanna would understand the choice he had made, or if she would see it as just another form of violence. A week later, Tommy was preparing to leave the territory forever when he received an unexpected message. It was delivered by a Navajo trader who said he had been asked to find Tommy by the Apache woman who heals. The message was written on a piece of bark in careful English script. "Young warrior, I have heard of the choice you made and the price you paid for it. Know that your sacrifice was not in vain. The spirits honor those who choose the difficult path of justice over the easy road of loyalty to evil. Your father's reign of terror has ended, and many innocents will live because of your courage. Walk in peace on your new path. The blessings of my ancestors go with you." Ayanna, Tommy read the message 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in his shirt pocket next to his heart. Somehow, Knowing that the Apache medicine woman approved of his choice made the pain of his losses more bearable. He had honored the second chance she had given him, had used his new life for something worthwhile. As his train pulled away from the station, carrying him toward an uncertain but hopeful future in Oregon territory, Tommy reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A copperhead's bite had nearly killed him, but it had also saved him in ways he was still discovering. An Apache medicine woman's mercy had given him more than just his life back. It had given him his soul. The desert landscape rolled past his window, harsh and beautiful in the late afternoon light. Somewhere out there, Ayana was probably making her way toward Mexico and whatever remained of her free people. Tommy hoped she would find the peace she was seeking, just as he hoped to find redemption in the new life he was building. The copper-colored death had found him in that abandoned mining camp, just as Ayana had predicted. But death had been defeated by something more powerful than venom. The choice to show mercy to an enemy, to heal rather than hate, to break the cycle of violence that had consumed so many lives. Tommy Blackwood, son of Iron Jack, was dead. In his place sat a man who had learned that true strength lay not in the ability to inflict pain, but in the courage to choose compassion even when it came at great personal cost. The lessons of the Apache medicine woman would guide him for the rest of his days, a reminder that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it.